Okay. Hi, everybody. If you could take your seats, please, here in the room. Time is tight. Excellent. Look, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Tom Keating. I'm director here at RUSI of our Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies. And you are very welcome for joining us today for this wonderful opportunity to hear from what I think of as one of the key individuals responsible for addressing an issue which I, and indeed all of us here in the UK, champion, which is a more robust response to illicit finance at home, of course, internationally as well. So we welcome this afternoon Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's been a senator for Rhode Island since 2007. And as a member of the Senate Committee on Finance, has gained a reputation as a relentless champion of reforms for combating money laundering and other forms of illicit finance. If I had a pound or a dollar for every time colleagues from across the Atlantic say, "You've really got to meet the senator," I would probably be doing something else now. So it's really fantastic to have the opportunity. And I can shout at Paul Massaro, "I have met the senator," which is often how Paul greets anybody. So one would hope that there is nothing more bipartisan than combating illicit finance. But for some reason, we, and by this I mean the US and the UK, who are key guardians of the integrity of the global financial system, seem to have struggled with taking that responsibility seriously, particularly when it comes to keeping our own houses in order. Our treasuries are quick to point out to other countries where they are going wrong, but our track record of walking the talk is not what it should be. I'll not recap the list of issues we need to address, as I'm sure they'll be covered in the next hour. But suffice to say, the US would not have made the progress it has made in the past few years without the tireless efforts of the senator and a number of his colleagues in Congress. And we hope that his energy will continue to be directed towards fixing the loopholes that remain, and that his energy can likewise help the British government maintain the welcome progress it has been making over the past year. Now, over the past couple of years, we at RUSI have been running what we call TARIF, which is our task force on a transatlantic response to illicit finance. Duncan always congratulates me on my ability to think up acronyms, so that's one of the ones I'm most proud of. But it's a great honor, therefore, to welcome Senator Whitehouse into this discussion, joined today by Duncan Hames, the Director of Policy and Programs at Transparency International, a member of our TARIF task force, someone with a bit of political experience himself, and the recent recipient of a master's from King's College London, which we all congratulate him on, and my colleague, Catherine Westmore, who's Senior Research Fellow at RUSI and co-leads our UK Economic Crime Programme. And to complete the picture, as moderator of today's discussion, we are also delighted to welcome journalist Jim Fitzpatrick, whose succinct biography on the Open Democracy website says simply that he is the dirty money reporter. So on that, I will pass the floor to Jim. Again, Senator, you're very welcome, and I look forward to the conversation. Jim.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yep, dirty money reporter. I think it encompasses quite a lot, as I've discovered since I joined Open Democracy in September. So I'm delighted to be here, looking forward to a healthy discussion amongst our panel. And then when we get a chance, maybe we'll bring in some questions from the floor and from our online audience. I think I just want to start, Senator, with a very simple question, which is, why does the fight against illicit finance, dirty money, matter?
It matters because it's a national and international security issue. You may have read the famous Clash of Civilizations, Samuel Huntington. I think we're in a clash of civilizations. I think he misdiagnosed where the boundary in that clash would be. I think the boundary in that clash is actually between rule of law and non-rule of law. And a great deal of what has gone very badly wrong in recent decades has emerged from non-rule of law jurisdictions. And what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, I think, is a testament to that. So this is one of those arenas in which, by allowing this illicit finance world to exist, we are giving aid and comfort to the non-rule of law world that is our enemy.
And in a sense, it's not just a battle between rule of law and non-rule of law. It's how rule of law enables the non-rule of law, and the non-rule of law then undermines democracy in what we think of as rule of law countries.
Very unfortunate doom loop spinning right there right now. And but I think it's becoming more clear to more people that this does have international security implications. I think we're kind of almost over the top crested that argument, and we can, I think, now say that as long as we keep the pressure on, that point is largely made. And now the next question is, okay, with that point made, with this as a international security issue, where do we need to go to solve the problem? What is the destination and what are the key waypoints? And I think that's where all of you in civil society have an enormously important role to define the destination and the waypoints in such a way that governments are obliged to accept that and say, yes, we will set that as our goal and get to work on those waypoints.
And Catherine, do you think people are grasping why it matters here in the UK?
I think increasingly so. I think the events of the last year after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has really brought home to policymakers, to people, why some of these issues really, really matter. The devastating impact that corruption has, not just overseas, but in the UK as well. And we see it from overinflated property prices, real tangible reasons why illicit money is damaging the fabric of our society and our economy. And I think, as the senator rightly says, we are winning the argument on national security. It's about now, how do we translate this into action, and action which really resonates with the people? And how do we really get people, get the private sector, get all parts of the society and economy working together for the same goal, ultimately ridding our economy of dirty money?
That sort of ethical argument, which people like yourself, Duncan, have been making for years, that this needs to be tackled, there needs to be transparency, we need to show why this matters. Are you finding a more receptive ear now? And at what sort of point are we in that conversation? Where are we moving from, perhaps accepting the argument to action?
Yes, from time to time, but it's an awfully slow process, and there's plenty of opportunities to slip along the way. We should have learned, some policymakers did learn after the Scruple poisonings, that the embrace of dirty money here emboldens those with hostile interests to ours to act even on our own soil. And there were important policy victories that followed after that realization, but it was forgotten as quickly as it was learned. And this, not only does this embolden those hostile to us, but it starts to place doubts in our allies about how dependable we are. We read about those soon after the further invasion of Ukraine last year. And it's really important for unity amongst democracies in responding to the kind of threat that we are reflecting on after the last year, that we don't give our allies cause to doubt.
There's, of course, perhaps different approaches, different systems, different rhetoric perhaps used between the UK and the US. And I think it'd be interesting to sort of tease some of that out. But I think let's try and maybe tell the audience, if you will, Senator, just the state of play at the moment. I mean, what have you been doing over the last year? Where are things at with your fight against all of this in the US?
We have been pecking away to undo the havens for dirty money. We've succeeded with respect to shell corporations. The Treasury is working on a real estate regulation that could inhibit dirty money's role in real estate. We have a lot of work left to do on other enablers like hedge funds and investment banks and law firms and real estate operations and all of that. I think that we also need to upgrade our process for dealing with dirty money. Freezing it is pretty easy. Seizing it gets more complicated. Forfeiting it gets even more complicated. And I think the more we can rationalize that and expedite the process, obviously within proper rule of law bounds, you don't solve a non-rule of law problem by reverting to non-rule of law. But I think that there's a lot of sloppiness and difficulty in bureaucracy and unnecessary inefficiency in that system, and we could fix that. So we've been working on those two primary areas: take away the havens and improve processes.
But this is something that you, as a legislator, can take action on with your colleagues. You can get stuff done.
Yeah. No, everything that we have done has been bipartisan. Senator Graham, a Republican, Senator Crapo, Republican, Senator Grassley, Republican, were essential allies in getting the beneficial ownership bill passed. And it was actually harder for them than it was for me, because the apparatus that dirty money industry stood up to oppose us was traditionally the apparatus that supports their side. So they had to cross the United States Chamber of Commerce, they had to cross the American Bar Association, they had to cross the National Federation of Independent Businesses and stand by their guns. And to their great credit, they did.
Duncan, you've experienced, as a politician, as well as now somebody looking in from outside. But the UK system is quite different, isn't it? In terms of the ability, say, for instance, of a senior MP to drive legislative change and action.
Yes, sadly. I mean, it's often said that England is the mother of parliaments, but the Westminster Parliament is the Cinderella when it comes to legislative initiative. And when you hear about parliamentarians taking legislative initiatives in the UK, you hear about it because that is the exception, and it's quite rare. And so the challenge is to get government to grasp the agenda, and then when it brings forward its legislation, as it has done twice in the last 12 months, you have a window of opportunity where legislators are then empowered to shape and enhance that legislation. And we got that opportunity this year because in the immediate aftermath of the further invasion of Ukraine nearly a year ago, with fears of risks of escalation, the government wanted to reach for an economic response. And there was this intense focus on sanctions. And we argued, and I think persuaded government, that there was a potential Achilles heel to that approach, that you can't sanction what you can't see. And so we've had this really intense period of trying to address the deficiencies in our own register to make sure, and to bring about the register of overseas entities holding real estate in the UK, to make sure that we do have the right administrative architecture to support policies like the approach to sanctions. And I think the demand to go further is only going to increase. And it's important that it's not just those with high profile football clubs that are in line for action being taken against them, but that it should no longer be possible for oligarchs and associates of cronies of the Kremlin to be able to hide their wealth here on our doorstep.
And Catherine, from your perspective, we've seen a lot, obviously, on sanctions. We're seeing the economic crime bill making its way through Parliament. Is that fast and focused, or where are the gaps in practical terms at the moment? What would you identify?
I think as Duncan has said, we have seen more legislation over the last year in the UK from an economic crime perspective than we have for many years. But I think the problem in the UK has not always been the legislative framework. We have robust laws, regulations. From that perspective, there aren't that many loops, sort of ways that you can get around. But what we have seen consistently, and Companies House is a great example, but also when it comes to something like money laundering regulation of lawyers and accountants, is that those rules and regulations are not being applied. They are not being enforced correctly. They are letting people get away with behaviour which by law shouldn't be happening. But that enforcement has always been the UK's Achilles heel. And until we put more resources into enforcement, until we have more powers to compel companies, in particular private sector, to do the right thing, we are always going to be in this fight. We're always going to be losing this fight because all the rules, all the regulation, all the guidance in the world will not get you anywhere unless you're able to enforce those rules.
Yeah, resourcing is probably another big difference between the UK and the US. So, Senator, give us a couple of examples of how there are initiatives in the US to resource the agencies that tackle this stuff.
Well, I don't want to give us too much credit here. We have stood up klepto capture, which we've added resources to, and it brings together primarily Treasury, State, and Justice to work collectively in this issue and eliminate some of the bureaucratic obstacles. In theory, it does anyway. In operation, it's still new enough that it continues to need to prove itself. But that's been an important architectural change. We've also raised the funding going into FinCEN, the Treasury's investigation and enforcement agency, so that they have more resources to pursue all of this. I would argue that we are still operating way below the level that we need to, not commensurate with the national security hazard that this continues to present, and not consistent with the amoral, if not immoral, conduct that is enabled by all of this system. It's very hard to defend it, although people do.
When we think about the system here, then, Duncan, is there a danger that we'll have all these new laws, potentially, but agencies that just aren't resourced or equipped to action what the legislators want?
Yes, I wouldn't call that a risk. I mean, that's an ever-present danger in UK, but we should acknowledge the really quite substantial efforts that have been made in the last year in responding to this, whether they're in the Treasury or in sanctions or in the kleptocracy cell. There's been an enormous amount of work being done by law enforcement and civil servants. And what worries me is that it is crisis response and that there isn't a clear long-term sustainable footing for any of this. You know, even frankly, the enforcement job that we've been explaining needs to be done at Companies House. And that argument has been won that it's not just a registrar, but should be a partner of law enforcement agencies in fighting economic crime. You know, we even identified a potential sustainable funding basis for that effort through the company registration fee, so that funding for this doesn't have to compete with whatever is the most pressing social concern for public resources at any moment in time. But ministers have resisted throughout the passage of the most recent bill, putting in place that line of funding through higher registration fees. Ministers who I think were advocating this before they became ministers only weeks before. And we really do need to work out how we're going to move from best endeavors, of which the civil service can be very impressive for a moment in time, to something which is a long-term sustained commitment, because our foes are very patient. You know, they have been embedding themselves in the elite circles of this country in order to try and garner a degree of impunity over decades. And we need to be able to mount an economic counter-kleptocracy response which can last for longer than the issues in the headlines.
Sometimes the objections come in the form of principles, don't they? So, for instance, you're not talking about charging companies thousands of pounds to register. But it's almost this principle that it has to be so cheap that you can do it from across the world on a computer anonymously, and it's almost dressed up as a principle. And it's a bit like what we've seen over sanctions and sanction waivers, that the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation doesn't take any view on whether a case has merits, leaves that up to the courts. And so therefore sanctioned individuals can take any amount of legal action they want, even if it is slap cases. So how do you sort of resist that, turning what is actually a fundamental flaw in the system, but when you put up the argument, it comes back that this is a principle. It's a principle of access to justice, or it's a principle of, free enterprise.
well, you and your colleagues at Open Democracy have done some incredible work on this around the role of what we call enablers, in this case lawyers, in representing these actors, and not representing them as a basic human right. You know, if you're being prosecuted for a crime, obviously you need to have a lawyer defending you in court, but offering every advantage that comes with, you know, skillful, well-informed, educated professionals. And I think we need to take that conversation to these people who consider themselves professionals, and to have not just, you know, a kind of regulatory imposed measure, but to have of their own number a really searching, soul-searching conversation about what it means to be a professional, and when does upholding equal access to your services end up being an action which undermines the rule of law here and abroad.
I jump in to add that when the civil society groups and the media define the narrative correctly here, that has a strategic repercussion in our favor. The more that this is understood to be a national security issue, a fight of good versus evil, you know, aiders and abettors and people giving aid and comfort to enemy, all of that creates a much more positive pressure in that area. The other thing that I think would make a big difference, and again, it's where I think the press and civil society can have a huge effect, is that if we are in unity only about what evil is going on right now, then we've missed an opportunity to be in unity about what our destination is, our point where the world is now safe and transparent enough that we don't have this threat any longer. And the more clearly that we can articulate that destination and those waypoints, the more we take away from our adversaries the argument that this is all just relativistic. Oh, well, the UK doesn't do it and the US does. Oh, well, the EU doesn't do this. And, you know, you're disproportionately disadvantaging us compared to that whole argument. You can just put paid to if you've articulated clearly the right narrative, the ultimate destination, and key waypoints that show whether or not you're making it. It is no longer relevant that the UK is weaker in one area than the US, or the US is weaker in one area than the UK, if the point is that we are all moving together towards a point of safety.
So it's not about but trying to, once you define the narrative, you're saying that you can avoid that race to the bottom in terms of
Correct.
regulation and sort of promote and a climb back up
Climb
to the top. Yeah. Okay. So we'll maybe get back to that later on when we look ahead. And I'd like to bring in some questions shortly, and also for those that are online, if you want to submit questions via Zoom, we'll hopefully be able to see on the iPad here, and perhaps bring in some of those questions as well. Catherine, let's talk about the enablers then. And I know Oliver Billows here, whose book, Butler to the World, summarizes it in a very good way. Because, you know, in some ways, I think Oliver writes in his book about this idea of the US as the world's policeman. Well, if that's the case, and I know you might dispute that in some ways in relation to this issue, but is the UK the world's butler? Just like Jeeves, serving up the marvelous solutions to the rich who want them. So amongst those particular butlers that we have, Catherine, who's top of the list for reform?
And I will caveat this by saying you are talking to actually two people on the panel who are accountants by training. So
Well, just as well you're not lawyers then, okay?
I mean, I think the enabler community, whether that's lawyers, estate agents, accountants, hedge fund, all of it, they have all come under a huge amount of scrutiny over the last year of their behaviour, and I think they have, in many cases, not reacted to that scrutiny well at all, pushing back against things which seem entirely reasonable to us. Why should lawyers be perpetrating slaps, for example? A really strong example of where the legal profession doing something that is at the moment entirely legal, but are not acting in a way that we think professionals should be. So I think, for me, that is one of the key issues that we're seeing at the moment, because when we also talk about the role of civil society, investigative journalists, the work that democracy and others do, that work is being thwarted by a small group of the enablers, particularly lawyers, who are engaging in this kind of strategic warfare through law and are preventing stories, preventing names coming out into the open. And we all know that the antidote to corruption is transparency. The more transparency we have, the better. The more we'll be able to fight the flow of dirty money. But actually there are groups, specific groups, and they are a small number in the profession. They are not the bulk of the profession by any means, but they are deliberately adding to this problem. And we need to use all the tools that we have at our disposal, whether that's regulatory, whether that's enforcement, whether that's really engaging with the professions to drive cultural change from the ground up. But really, we need to do something because this enabler community, they have shown over the last few years that they are not able to regulate themselves. They will go after the money and they will enable all kinds of crimes and all kinds of dirty money to flow into the UK and the US that has no place in, or that should have no place in.
Yeah, I was at an event in Westminster not so long ago, and it was a kind of roundtable session, and there was a Lord Bishop there who does work with the criminal bar here in London, and he commented that he thought perhaps the civil bar and lawyers needed more training in ethics because it was work that he thought he'd actually got through to the criminal lawyers. So how do we? You were talking about confronting opposition. And it's not just about beating them down, it's about persuading them, shaming them perhaps.
Mhm.
So give us a few tips then, how you win over these very vested interests.
Well, it's a very difficult thing to do in the United States right now. We had a Supreme Court decision a decade ago that said big special interests can spend unlimited amounts of money in politics. If you can spend unlimited amounts of money in politics, you can threaten to spend unlimited amounts, and that gives you a very powerful persuasive effect without even leaving any ripples in the campaign finance world. And of course, we have now allowed them to do that anonymously, which makes it even more dangerous. So this is these groups are very much used to having their way. And it's hard to put a counterforce against them. The US Chamber of Commerce is by 3 times the biggest lobbying force in the United States compared to the number 2. And that's another corporate lobbying force. So it's really hard to go against them directly. The strategy that I followed was to go inside and create backfires among their members. How on earth is it that banks are putting up with the US Chamber having this position? How on earth are people who are like former prosecutors and so forth putting up with this? With the Bar Association, we went after the banking section, the money laundering section, the criminal law section, and created dissent within the organization that backed them off.
And when we think about money laundering in the UK, there are proposals to apply stricter money laundering regulations to litigation, which at the moment is largely exempt from the same regulations that would apply elsewhere. So you have a bizarre scenario where, lawyers taking cases on behalf of individuals who may, in fact, is commonly held, or people who have benefited from dirty money are being paid by that dirty money to fight cases, and are resisting changes to the law that would apply a stricter rule across what monies they can receive. It's kind of strange. We've given a lot of power to vested interests, such as lawyers.
Well, I don't know. I think this is an area where the UK and the US diverge, because the legal mischief that is done in the United States has much more to do with the organization and sheltering of assets, the establishment of trusts and corporations, the sort of creation of the architecture of secrecy for a bad actor. Litigation, not so much. In fact, what we're seeing in litigation is that an honest courtroom is actually a very effective counterpressure against bad actors, whether it's that creep Alex Jones and his constant badgering of the families whose children were murdered at the school in Connecticut, that the whole thing was a hoax and they were actors and there was no real shooting and their children didn't matter. he's had to pay, he's on the wrong side of enormous legal judgments. And Dominion, which what Fox has gone after, you just have probably seen in the news how they've found what the Fox mouthpieces were saying publicly, and on the same day what they were saying privately in their emails. So I suspect Fox is going to be writing a very big check to Dominion at some point. So what we're seeing is that, you know, honest courtrooms are actually a place where transparency is brought to bear on corruption and on sort of brutal use of the megaphone. So we just seem to be in a different position there than you are, and it probably has to do with the underlying law and the protections that we have against that kind of litigation.
Is this one of the harder nuts to crack? You know, getting the legal profession on board for some of the things that you might like to see done, Duncan?
Yes, I think so. Let me offer you an example. There is a individual who's been granted anonymity by the courts, who is challenging a decision by a judge to revoke that anonymity with a judicial review next month. And that decision to revoke it was based on him being a person of importance to a case that the National Crime Agency successfully brought relating to kleptocratic money laundering in the UK. He wasn't the suspect of that case, but he was considered to be by this judge a person of importance to it. And he is represented in this judicial review application by highly respected lawyers. One of them, I believe, a member of the House of Lords in our Parliament. So the sense in which the profession or professional people in the law believe that it shouldn't matter who they work for is really entrenched. And I would suggest that with characters like that, whether you're receiving his money for services rendered or in receipt of philanthropic or other donations, you ought to be doing your due diligence, and you ought to be asking yourself, do I really want to touch this money?
Does anyone want to come in with a question at this stage? We have a roving mic. So yes, we'll just come down to this row here and then we'll jump there.
Yeah, thank you all very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I used to be the old Customs and Excises intelligence analyst for TNOC and the ex-Soviet states. I first identified Wagnerism 25 years ago this month. My question is, what preparations are being made to coordinate the Kleptocapture Task Force, work with the other Five Eyes and the UK going onward to work with Switzerland and the EU member states and EU centrally, particularly in the light that the EPPO in Luxembourg is now tentatively up and running. Its remit is limited, but the intelligence it will gather will be huge. And of course, in a few years' time, we've got AMLA. I say this because I've worked in EU programs in Ukraine. They were not best practice. They gave huge green lights to Putin. We need to get this right, to do it properly and avoid huge penetration by bad guys. I could go on, but I'll stop there. Be very worried indeed, because what I saw was diabolical. And please read, if you haven't, many will, of course, Catherine Belton alongside Tom Clancy's Command Authority and Commander-in-Chief. Those two books were textbooks, not novels. Thanks.
Thank you.
Catherine, have you any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's absolutely right that one of the key things that we need is better intelligence sharing between countries. That is absolutely key here. These are vast international networks of people, and we need to have a law enforcement response that is commensurate with that. We need to match them. We cannot operate in silos. Yeah, absolutely. And
strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it needs to happen. I think there are some really good examples of where intelligence is being shared across countries. Clearly, we need to do more. And I think, as you sort of highlighting, you mentioned Ukraine, there is going to be a huge amount of funds flowing back into Ukraine to deal with the reconstruction there. Those kind of projects, we see it in climate change as well, and all the amount of money that's flowing around renewable energy. Those kind of projects are ripe for corruption and ripe for oligarchs and kleptocrats to benefit. They're ripe for fraud, and we need to make sure that we do have a joined up international response to ensure that we put the best practices and controls in these projects from the start.
Just want to grab another question there.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is George Kiritopoulos. I'm an assistant director at Deloitte Forensics Financial Crime Prevention. It's quite interesting what you've actually said, Senator, but while we've had OFAC and OFSI coming together to share a best practices symposium, perhaps one area you could look at is what the Canadians have done with their 1998 Special Measures Economics Act, which states that sanction circumvention and evasion will be an international breach of security. And perhaps framing it with a national security argument may get further momentum. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, 2 thumbs up on making it a national security argument. I was not aware of the Canadian law. I'll look at it when I get back and follow up on that. And to what the other gentleman said, we've just sorted out klepto capture working among the different government agencies, and they do have a channel to our intelligence services, and building that infrastructure out into other international organizations, I think, is critical to success in all of this, step by step.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying that no one country needs to wait. If you've got the narrative right, you can move ahead without saying, look at those guys. But at the same time, I believe you also have said, and I was looking at a speech you gave recently about the need for collective action so you don't have leakage in certain areas.
Well, you have 2 problems with collective action. One is leakage, and the other is if there's no articulation of where we intend to go, then the conversation is all about who's where, who's stronger, who's weaker, and it's just a question of sort of relativistic advantage and what are you doing? Why should my state agents have to do this when realtors in the United States don't? And that's just a completely stupid conversation to have. And the way you reboot it is by saying we're all going to get there, and we're going to get there as quickly as we can, and it's going to take some doing, but that's where we're going. And then this kind of quarrelsome narrative of relative advantage and disadvantage begins to evaporate.
Do you think that the international alliance is, Duncan, strong enough on this, that there is an action plan attached to it? What would you like to see?
Well, firstly, I wholeheartedly agree with the senator about the need for clarity about the destination, about where we're heading, to give some drive to some of these multilateral processes, whether that's the Summit for Democracy or the work that's being done by the member governments in the Financial Action Task Force. But to answer your question, Jim, I don't think all of the architecture is quite there yet. But there are some things that we can build from. We don't have to start from scratch. We have the International Anti-Corruption Coordination Centre, which has been in London since the summit of 2016. Only a couple of months ago, I understood that the initial kind of setup period of funding and operation for that centre was coming to an end. So there are questions about how to put that on a more sustainable footing. It's not just Five Eyes. I think there are observer countries. I think Switzerland, that was mentioned, might be one of those. But it was our former Prime Minister, the most recent one, who last night in Parliament talked about the need for an economic NATO. Now, contrary to her detractors, she wasn't talking about the European single market. She was talking about economic measures as a national security defense partnership amongst our allies. And I think what she was speaking to, obviously based on her experience, both as Foreign Secretary and subsequently, of trying to bring about an economic response to the invasion of Ukraine, was that we don't have the same stature and standing of collaboration with our allies. It is not the established way. It is what they choose to do in order to have most effect. Let's try and coordinate rather than let's have a very clear expectation that we are going to act in partnership and that we are an alliance. And bringing that kind of infrastructure to our economic response to those that threaten us, I think there is something in that idea, and we ought to get beyond the politics and try and find a way to make a reality of it.
Great. Anybody else want to come in with a question? Just at the front here. I have a couple just at the front. Right front row there.
Thank you. Richard Gould from Illicit Finance Consulting, and that's working for combating, not allowing them to actually.
Wanted to be clear on that, thank you.
Just before I get arrested at the door.
Be a little on the nose and have that be your name, if it was the other way around.
I've got two questions, but I'll keep to the strategic one to begin with. I've had 35 years in law enforcement, various agencies, virtually all of it involved in financial crime of one kind or another. Ended up in Oliver's books on a couple of occasions, regrettably on the losing side more often than not. One of the reasons that it is the losing side more often than not, in my view, is the drive that politicians have got for deliverables which are just impossible to do in the timeframes that they put forward. Anyone in this room that is involved in large-scale financial crime, illicit finance of any description whatsoever, knows, one, it is going to be international. Two, there is going to be an equality of arms between, and I use the term us, and the defense legal teams. And three, it takes years, and I do mean years, to get it anywhere near the finishing line. And yet the politicians demand results from primary law enforcement agencies and to a lesser extent prosecution authorities. Every year we want figures on the doors. They're incompatible. So my question is, what does the panel think should be done to persuade politicians to drop ridiculous deadlines and targets and actually bite the bullet to support law enforcement and the agencies to deliver what is actually needed in relation to illicit finance flows?
Got some supporters there. Senator.
I don't know how much that pertains to the United States. We have a very, very strong convention that people in my line of work stay out of the business of people in the prosecution line of work. I've been on both sides of that line and I've defended it very rigorously as a prosecutor. And I respect it very rigorously as a legislator. So I will push and harass the Department of Justice to at least look at things that I think are obvious. The same way you tell a policeman down the street, there's a broken window and it seems like there's a lot of stuff missing from the storefront. You might want to go have a look. But after you've done that, you have to step out in my system. So that's about where I end.
Catherine, do you think the system here is plagued by that sort of short-termism?
Absolutely. I think it is. And I think that need, as you say, you articulated the need for targets, the need for headlines, the need for X number of arrests or X amount of money seized. Yeah, I think that does drive a lot of the thinking, and it's hard to be strategic and have a 10-year vision when you're as a law enforcement unit, your funding may only last for a year and you have to demonstrate certain results and it's not operating in the right in a way that will get the right outcomes. I think we have to really change that focus, because I think anybody who works in this space knows that it is far more effective to prevent things from happening in the first place than it is to go after them from a law enforcement and prosecutorial perspective. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, more effective if we can harden our defences so that there aren't oligarchs and kleptocrats abusing the UK financial system, rather than having to try and catch up with them. But that, I absolutely agree, is a very hard argument to win with politicians who want headlines.
Thanks, Simon. Do you want to come in? Yeah.
I mean, I hope you'll find that I haven't been unfairly critical of people working with limited resources in the course of my comments today. But I'm not going to apologise for my impatience for results. It took us the best part of 10 years to get the UK Bribery Act. Yeah, it's taken, well, the Panama Papers was over 6 years ago now, and what prosecutions have we had off the back of that? It's taken several years to get the guilty plea and conviction of GPT after the whistle was blown about corporate bribery in Saudi Arabia. It is incredibly slow, and we need to do something about being able to bring people to justice, because justice delayed is justice denied. And I don't just blame the law enforcement actors for this. You know, we had a British Attorney General who sat on the GPT case for the best part of 2 years, declining to give the green light to the Serious Fraud Office to prosecute. So you know, there are some politicians with questions to answer about that as well. But I'm not going to apologize for our impatience to see justice done.
Thanks, Doug. I'm sorry,
If I could just add one more point, I do think that there are ways in which we can try to streamline the capacity of agencies to proceed. For instance, we're working right now on trying to make it simpler for the United States, when it freezes and then wishes to seize an asset, to proceed against the asset. And let the world know that we're proceeding against that asset, and anybody who has a claim to it, you show up. Rather than having to chase through the Russian nesting dolls of shell corporations and Cypriot bank accounts and all of that to show who should be in the courtroom. Make it the other side's responsibility to show up. That is completely consistent with all our traditional standards of due process. Indeed, it's actually the law for US citizens for assets below $500,000 in value. So things like that can make it much, much easier for our law enforcement folks to do that. You get predication. Remember that boat that the Ukrainians sank, right? You went down into the basement, pulled the plug, and the yacht sank. If he was willing to sink the yacht, he might be willing to talk to us and say, I know who owns that yacht. I can testify to who owns that yacht. I can give you the predication to proceed against that yacht. You put the yacht on, you know, United States versus yacht Miramar, whatever the hell it was called, and then let them show up and be waiting with handcuffs.
And can we get to this kind of Robin Hood law where you are taking from the kleptocrats and distributing to those that deserve it?
That's a very interesting boundary, and it's the boundary between what law of war allows hostile nations to do to each other's property when they're in active conflict, and rule of law, where you have to have certain procedural steps before you can take private property away. And pushing towards recognizing the strategic implications of all of this is going to be, I think, important as you define how closely you can move to those rule of war boundaries while staying within rule of law conventions.
Great, another question here, and maybe our last, I'm afraid.
Hi, Denise Rudich, I'm the Senior Advisor to the Century. I'm also a social I have 2 questions. Oh, hi. I'm prepping. Can you hear me? Anything else? Okay, great.
We can hear it.
I'm not going to do my introduction.
Yeah.
2 questions. First of all, we previously used to have an anti-corruption. Do not have. Do you think there is a need for an anti-corruption champion or an finance champion? Initiatives that are linked to financial flows and maybe at this parts. And my second question is, so I'm a big believer in partnerships and intelligence sharing. Is there a world in which you can see like a Transatlantic leadership initiative where, for example, jointly the Regional Intelligence Task Force, jointly intelligence task force. Sorry, thank you. And the section 314B Act could meet on a transatlantic basis.
Okay, let's go with the UK question first. Do we need an anti-corruption czar? Is kind of what they're sometimes called, but maybe in this context, that might be the right word.
I think we've had enough of czars, but we do need some really clear leadership on anti-corruption. There's an anti-corruption, there's a refresh of the anti-corruption strategy due. We're awaiting the second economic crime plan, and a lot of the issues actually require people to work across government, across different government departments, which is one of the arguments in favor of what had been a really long-standing arrangement. I think it goes back to Jack Straw of having a influential political figure as an anti-corruption champion. I know there are proposals for an ethics and integrity commission, and maybe the architecture will change. But right here, right now, without any of that, we do need some clear leadership, and it's regrettable that in the various movement of ministerial positions over the course of the last 6 months, that not one of now 3 prime ministers has managed to fill the vacancy that John Penrose left as the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion.
Catherine, any thoughts on that, just briefly?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Duncan. I mean, there are so many different parts of the system involved in the fight against economic crime that we need some system leadership. We need somebody who's accountable. That's the way that we will get things done, is having somebody senior who is there to say that this needs to be a priority, this needs to underpin all the work of the different government departments that are involved in it. So yeah, absolutely that role. I mean, it needs to have powers behind it. It needs to be senior enough. It needs to be respected. It needs to have clout. But yeah, absolutely. I think we need that role filled.
And Senator, on the transatlantic intelligence
The
sharing.
more and the more efficiently that law enforcement and intelligence can work together, the better off we will all be. But I think that the primary goal needs to be to go back to my earlier argument, set the destination, agree internationally on what that destination looks like, set waypoints towards it, and start to move in that direction. I think better integration and interaction in a world in which we have not yet done that is not likely to be ultimately very successful. I think that we need to set the goal very clearly and pursue it very diligently and identify its key waypoints, and then that's a framework that brings a lot of the interaction into a more effective posture, I would say.
And if I could just ask you all briefly to sum up, as we sit here a year on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a lot has happened. It has set the context for a lot of what we've discussed here today. What would you be saying a year from now? What would you like to be reporting on in terms of progress if you were to put yourself here a year hence? Duncan.
Well, you know that there is already a deadline which is almost to that timetable, which is the commitments that British Overseas Territories made to the British government to follow through on implementing public registers of company beneficial ownership. If they were to deliver on those commitments to the timetable that they committed to, we would be celebrating that right now in a year's time, and that even gives them an extra month, which I'd be happy to concede if that was the happy position that we would be in. But I think I will refer to one of the objectives I cited earlier, which was in relation to the professions. You know, it's not just about what government must do and what parliaments can set regulations for. Actually, I think we need some soul searching and some ownership by these great institutes that are our professions into what they might do themselves to get their house in order in relation to how expectations might now have changed about our attitudes to questionable money from very questionable sources, and the difference that it makes to our own security at the end of the day.
Thanks, Duncan. Catherine?
I think we're at, in the UK, an interesting time from a policy perspective. We are expecting a new economic crime plan in the next couple of months, broad strategy, anti-corruption strategy. There's a lot of work going on to refresh the UK government's position on a lot of these things. Obviously mindful that we are heading towards an election as well. For me, what I would like to see over the next year is a lot of the good thinking that has gone on in the background translating into real action. Start seeing some enforcement action against sanction evasion, for example, to move the freeze to seize debate rather than just talking about it to actually moving to where we're actually doing thing about it. Yeah, we've had, I think, a lot of delays, the political turmoil in the UK over the last 6-9 months has caused a lot of these really, really good policy initiatives that need to move forward, whether it's dealing with the professions, whether it's dealing with asset recovery, have stalled because of the political situation that we found ourselves in. So we need to move forward with actions. We need to acknowledge that there is a lot that we still need to do in the UK. And hopefully some of these policy vehicles will start putting that right, but that definitely translates into action now.
Thanks, Catherine. Senator, from your perspective.
I would say that I would like to be able to report that we have a common vision for a world in which giving refuge to shady finance is just as unacceptable as giving refuge to child labor. That we've identified the standards that will enforce that vision, and that we are on our way to making sure that that is a common platform across all of our major economies.
Thank you very much. I wish you all the best of luck in your endeavours, and I'll do my bit chipping away from the outside and reporting on things. So thank you. I'll unfortunately have to bring things to a close there, but people are on a tight schedule. Thank you all very much for giving up your lunch hour to join us. And I'm going to hand back now to Tom.
Yeah, I insist on having the last word.
You should.
Exactly. Look, thank you very much indeed. You know what really depresses me? It's nearly 9 years since we started this program at RUSI, and generally we violently agree on what needs to happen. But for some reason, we found it very difficult to kind of achieve momentum necessary to secure the victories in legislation or funding, or whatever it might be that we want. For utterly tragic reasons, we do have that momentum now. We have developed that momentum over the last year. We have leadership in the White House, which, you know, I remember us all reading what President Biden was saying before he came into power. And we think, here's a guy who gets illicit finance. We have leadership in Congress. We even have a minister in the UK now, the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, who, having harangued the government for many years as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, is now in a position to do something. And having listened to his remarks in Washington, the Hudson Institute recently, he's definitely nailing his colors to the mast, and we need to hold him to his commitments. So we have the opportunity to make progress, and as in whether it's your kind of football or our kind of football, your momentum is what leads to victory and success. And so we really do need to make sure we press ahead with that. And I like the kind of head up vision statements that you closed with there, Senator, because I think sometimes in our world we get obsessed with the minutiae of paragraph 3, subsection 2 of a new bit of legislation, and that's important, but we need vision, and we need vision from our leadership. And so I would encourage us all to hold our leadership to account on defining that vision, and then, as you say, delivering on it. So with that, thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Thank you to those of you who were online. And to continue the football analogy, we will now pass the football back to his handlers and make sure he gets